In 1901, just to show you another fear that comes at this particular time, William McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist, sparking fears of imported political change, and people talked about how anarchists came in the open gates, and thus there was a cry amongst many for shutting the gates to immigration. International events also contributed to this whole process. In 1904-1905, the Japanese defeated the Russians, which sent alarm bells amongst whites, but again against elite whites, not anybody else. It's not like ordinary Americans kind of suddenly got very upset about this, except out in the West Coast, which I'll talk about. They were very upset that a colored nation could defeat a white nation. This was a new thing. And it was celebrated by, for instance, the African-American W.E.B. Du Bois as being a great day for colored people all over, that a colored nation could defeat the white nation. But it was very much feared, even though it was celebrated in various different places in India and Africa, especially amongst colonial subjects. What was much more marked was the fear of the colonial overlords and the fear of, for instance, of whites in the South, and the fear of those in the West who had Japanese immigration coming in. It very much affected Theodore Roosevelt, who promptly after the 1904-1905 war, in which he had vaguely favored the Japanese, he sent the so-called White Fleet, which had White Fleet just on the side, just in case you didn't really catch the metaphor. Old Teddy Roosevelt very much emphasized the White Fleet and sailed it past Japan, ostensibly on a peaceful mission, but sort of White Fleet going by Japan, and that's very much what he was trying to get across. He also called on more women in America, native women that is, to have more children to prevent what he called race suicide. And this race suicide idea was very, very important amongst groups of the elite. It had come from the Immigration Restriction League, but it very much was followed up in magazine articles and all the rest, where the American race was being choked to death by immigrants who had loads and loads of children, and this prevented American laborers who could not afford to have so many children from having children, and therefore the American race was going to be swamped by all these other races. It's still a vague fear at this stage. World War I very much called attention to what now would be called inter-ethnic clashes in the Balkans. Very interesting, ethnic was not a term that was used in the interwar period of time. In fact, they talk about race. So they talked about the Romanian race versus the Hungarian race. All of these, there was no sort of exacting definition to race at this particular time. Very interesting kind of thing. And there were inter-ethnic clashes between the Balkans and the ethnically German threat of the United States. In World War I, this all comes to a height. The Balkan clashes are talked about in racial terms, and there were German Americans inside the United States, this is the fifth column, and dissidents were simply not tolerated. So the First World War really makes the American state sit up and take notice of these kind of issues. And what really hits is the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And this fuels a panic about foreign radicals coming in. As it happens, most of the radicals were homegrown that existed in the United States. Not an insubstantial amount, despite your images of the United States. It's worth remembering that Eugene Debs, the Socialist Party head, who was put into prison for publishing a cartoon saying "Making the World Safe for Capitalism." This was his crime that he was put into prison for a number of years for. He was voted for as a prisoner number 9619. I'm remembering the number, and it may not be right. But he received over 1 million votes from Americans at that particular time. So there was an ideological threat, but it was much more homegrown. But it was presented as if foreign radicals were teeming into our country, and we've got to shut them off. Here you can see the liberty lamp in my slide. Come unto me, you oppressed, and of course there's an anarchist with a bomb ready to come in and sneak behind Lady Liberty and put a bomb and stab a knife into her and that sort of nastiness. looking extraordinarily like Trotsky, Leon Trotsky. But I suppose many anarchists kind of affected that one. 1917, the Immigration Act of 1917 is a piece of legislation, and it is denying entry to, quote, idiots, imbeciles, or others who would become a public charge. It also introduced an Asiatic barred zone, the denizens of which were not eligible for citizenship, although it left it fairly vague in terms of immigration. And you can see the picture of the Asiatic barred zone, which is kind of interesting because it cuts through the middle of China and includes Japanese. It does not ban the Japanese at this particular time, or Japanese territories as they were at that time, Japanese influenced territories. So they were not barred, and neither were the Filipinos, who, of course, this was an American colony at this particular time. However, post-war immigration restriction took on a new, the campaign for immigration restriction took on a new edge after the First World War. The Big Red Scare, as it was called, focused on the steel strike of 1919, and it labeled those striking as foreigners and non-strikers as Americans. Now, it was reasonably accurate in doing so, and it was a lot of young men from Eastern European, especially, working with steel. The steel workers, if you've ever seen the movie, and probably nobody has ever seen this movie except for me, this is what happens when I try and use a movie metaphor. However, The Deer Hunter, okay, occasionally, yes, you over the age of I don't know, 25 may have seen it. But this actually talks about the steelworkers, and they all have these Polish names. They're all Poles, they're Ukrainians, Serbians, all these various different nationalities have come in. And the steel strike is big, 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 and involves nearly 500,000 strikers. It could have spread, it could have gone anywhere. But one of the great uses that they have to delineate the strikers from others is to say that the American workers tend not to strike, whereas it's the radicals, these Bolsheviks, these anarchists that come in outside the shore. It was, again, inaccurate. Americans were striking just the same as everybody else, but it did accurately capture the fact that these young men with nothing to lose, who were paid terrible wages and were striking for an 8-hour day, were the ones that were very much willing to be on the picket lines. It's also worth talking about the rise of the Ku Klux Klan at this particular time. The Ku Klux Klan had an estimated 4 or 5 million members. That's probably an overestimation in 1923. However, it did have in the millions of members. And here, as you can see, is a march down towards the Capitol in the United States. Very accepted organization, and it was talked politely by presidents. There's even one report of President Harding becoming a Kleagle or Klaxon or whatever their highest office is, I can't remember. Grand Cyclops, that's the one. And an investiture inside the White House. Now, I haven't been able to find corroboration of that, so I hesitate to, as a historian, to actually say that that's gospel truth, but certainly maybe an apocryphal story. But it certainly does indicate the sort of very amenable. The United States was very friendly generally to the Ku Klux Klan. It was not definitely. It had only been revived in 1915. It was not definitely aimed at African Americans as we tend to think of it, but it was aimed at immigrants. It was aimed at jazz music, urban influences, short skirts. It was very much in favor of prohibition at the time. It was against anything modern. And immigrants seemed to encapsulate, for many Americans, everything that was modern and everything that was wrong about society. The interesting thing about the Johnson-Reed Act, or the Immigration Act of 1924, is that it captures all of these anxieties that Americans have, all of the anxieties about politics, all of the anxieties about religion, very much, I should have said about the Ku Klux Klan, a very Protestant organization, and it was against the so-called drinking Catholic religions of the urban areas. And the Immigration Act of 1924 takes all of these anxieties and it turns them into race. The Immigration Act of 1924 included the National Origins Act and the Asian Exclusion Act. It set the annual quota of any nation at 2% of the number of foreign-born persons of such nationality resident in the continental United States in 1890. It did that very specifically, avoiding the 1900 and the 1910 and the 1920 censuses. And it wanted to go back to 1890. Why? Because it wanted to capture the racial makeup that existed in 1890. So it was a blatantly racial act. It was very much aimed at saying what the Nordic, what they called Nordic at the time, which is Northern and Western European nations, and it said that they are the true Americans, and that any of those Mediterranean nations can become true Americans if they really try and take on American ways and basically give up their radicalness, and that there are un-Americans, which is anybody who is not white. And this act represented the triumph of racial thinking in this ways. It was justified by eugenics experts. It was justified in many different ways, but it represented the triumph of racial thinking. Immigration restriction was not to be based on political allegiance or on occupation or on religion. Instead, it was to be based on a racial origin of the applicant. The effects of the 1924 Immigration Act cut numbers arriving to 150,000 per year from 1929. Germans, Irish, British given first choice. Italians, Greeks, and Slavs and others were cut down to 3% of their pre-war average immigration average. It stifled discussion. The other interesting thing about this act is, for instance, the Ku Klux Klan collapsed dramatically 2 years after the act. Why? Because all of their anxieties had been alleviated by this act that kept America American, as President Calvin Coolidge said at the time. So it stifled discussion about race. In some ways, you could argue that it killed off Prohibition. This is experimental. Don't write this down on your papers because this is experimental, but it's an interesting way of thinking about it. Prohibition was very much an anti-Catholic impetus, and with this act, it privileged Nordic Americans right at the top and Nordic American Protestants right at the top. So therefore, all of these anxieties of the rural areas against the urban areas, which is what Prohibition represented, was alleviated, and the steam went out of the Prohibition movement, although it went on until 1933. And so it stifled these many different anxieties and changed the face of the United States. It limited immigration. It limited the huge growth that had taken place in the 19th century, and it put a limit on that, and it instituted that limit. And it also limited very much racially what Americans were. It defined Americans as white. Those who were not white became un-American, and that's even African Americans who had been there generations against, when their ancestors had been brought against their own will, but they had been there as long from 1609 onwards. They were declared un-American by this act, and it very much put in the idea that America is a white entity, not a political entity, not this, but a white entity. So when was the 1924 Immigration Act superseded? People sometimes present Franklin Roosevelt as a great liberal on race relations. No, not particularly. In 1934, during the New Deal, the Tydings-McDuffie Act reclassified Filipinos as aliens, and in 1935, the Filipino Repatriation Act provided free transportation for Filipinos to return to the Philippines. Very similar to what the National Front does in Britain in the last 10 years. And also, anybody who's been to Washington to look at the museums there, I hardly recommend doing this. They're all free. And has gone to the Holocaust Museum will know that Jews died because they could not disembark from a ship because of the 1924 Act. In 1938, they had taken a ship and it was not allowed to into New York Harbor, basically because it would have contravened the 1924 Act, and that they went back and ended up in Germany, and many of them died as a result. So the Roosevelt years were not the most liberal in terms of race relations, and the 1924 Immigration Act was not superseded, until 1952, and even then it wasn't really superseded. It was simply, they took the racial restrictions out, but kept the quotas just the same as they were. And it was only really in 1965 that the Act was gotten rid of altogether, and that you have a new era of immigration coming up. So how did U.S. attitudes, just to summarize what I've said, how did U.S. attitudes towards immigration change in the 20th century? First, immigration that had fueled the growth of the United States in the 19th century became seen as a threat. Second, discussion about immigration shifted away from the supposed political threats from immigrants, from the wages threat to labor, and the issue of competition, yes, the issue of competition with labor, and they coalesced around racial concerns. Immigration came to be seen as a threat to the racial stability of the United States. And in fact, this was the great justification for immigration restrictions. And third, even after the 1965 Act superseded the 1924 Act, the issue of the ethnic makeup and the assimilability of immigrants to the United States remains. I don't see that there's any great justification. This is a bit political, so again, caution on this. But I don't see that you can talk about the assimilability of one group and compare it with the assimilability of the others. All who come to the United States, as I said at the very beginning, who take up and agree to obey their constitution, their laws, anybody should be able to become American. And I think you will find that there is no racial element of assimilability to a political nation like the United States. Thank you very much.